Hey everyone, welcome back to a new school year full of new math classes. A couple of days ago I recorded the first geography lesson of the year, but as you guys know, if you've been following the updates on Instagram, I'm going to be teaching geography, math, and science. So here is the first math lesson of the year. Um, One thing I forgot to mention in the geography video, and I'll try and remember to mention this in the science video that I record after this, is I'm going to be naming each of the lessons using this format at the bottom, where the U stands for the unit that we're working on, so the unit number, and the L stands for the lesson number. So I'm going to try and title every lesson using that so that you can hopefully somewhat easily find what you need if you go back and look for information from a previous unit. Um, so yeah, so this is our first unit, which is just an introductory unit and the first lesson of that. So let's get into the kinds of things that we're going to see in this course. So for those of you who had this math class with me last year, you'll recognize a lot of the same things this year that we covered last year, but there will be some changes and some differences between what we talked about last year and what we talk about this year. So last year we talked about multiplication and division, both of whole numbers and how to go about doing that without a calculator, but also multiplication and division involving fractions and decimals. So this year I'm going to try and sort of combine those ideas together, and we're just going to focus on the multiplication and division with fractions and decimals, just as a little bit of a reminder of how that stuff works before we go on with everything else. We'll cover some other basic things like BEDMAS, and we'll cover some ground rules for exponents and logarithms and things like that before we get into the big topics of the year, which will be algebra, linear functions, quadratics, and trigonometry. So I'm going to talk about all of these um, in a few minutes, but you can see on this slide that there are a lot of things that we studied last year that are going to show up again this year. So if there's something that I'm not explaining particularly well or I'm not explaining thoroughly in the videos this year, feel free to go back to last year's videos. They're all still there, and just look through that for the topic that you want, because I'm gonna probably go a little bit faster for some topics that I've already covered once or twice previously. So I'm going to try and go through everything at a slow enough pace that if this is your first time seeing it, it all makes sense and it's not too fast. But if you're finding that you're struggling, or you're finding that I'm going too fast or not explaining it very well this time around, try going back to last year's videos where maybe I explained things a little bit differently. And then if that's still not working, let me know, and we'll see if we can sort something out. So on top of the topics on the last slide, there are going to be some new things that we explore this year as well that we didn't get to last year, but that I also didn't intend to get to last year. So of course last year I was hoping that we could cover some quadratic functions and some trigonometry towards the end of the school year, but my exams and my workload started to pick up. COVID got in the way of everything. I had to move home. Things got really hectic. So we weren't really able to cover that stuff. And you guys had complications as well with having to sort out how to go about your classes from home. So hopefully we'll be able to cover all of that stuff this year. But before we get to quadratics and trigonometry, we are going to cover some new topics, which you can see up here. And we are going to hopefully get through a unit on geometry and a unit on probability and statistics. Now, this is something that I haven't focused on with you guys before, so hopefully you find this easy to understand and hopefully beneficial in some way. Now, the first unit that we're going to be covering is just an intro kind of unit. I'm hoping to not spend too much time on it, but I do want to spend enough time on it that we have the basics under our belt before we move on to more complicated things. So the first unit is going to be talking about things like BEDMAS, which is also known as the order of operations. So the way in which you would go about calculating an answer if I gave you a mathematical expression that had a whole bunch of different things going on. If there's some addition and some multiplication and something in brackets and something with an exponent, you need to know what thing to do first in order to get the right answer. You need to know the order of those operations in order to get the right answer. So you might have seen it under a different name like PEMDAS or BODMAS or something like that. But we're going to start by going over that. Then we're going to move to multiplication and division involving decimals. And I haven't written it in here, but we'll also probably have time to squeeze in a little bit of multiplication and division involving fractions. It's not particularly difficult, so I'll explain how it works. But then if you want examples of it, I would suggest you go back to last year's videos on the topic because I go through plenty of examples there. After that, we'll focus on different types of fractions, how to convert between improper fractions and mixed numbers, things like that. We'll talk about reducing fractions to their simplest terms, and we'll talk about working with fractions in terms of addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, and maybe a little bit with exponents in there as well. So our second unit, after we've gotten through everything that sort of covers the basics, once we've got that under our belt, we'll move on to geometry, which will involve basically what you can see on the screen right now. So first we'll start with perimeter and area. So we'll talk about what perimeter is, what area is. We'll practice calculating the perimeter and area of some simple shapes. I'll give you the formulas for how to do it, and then you just have to go ahead and figure out exactly how it works. I'll give you a whole bunch of practice problems that you can study to get a feel for how to calculate those things. And then after that, we'll move on to surface area and volume. So it's basically the same idea as perimeter and area, but perimeter and area deal with two-dimensional shapes. Oh, that's not a great two. They deal with two-dimensional shapes, and then surface area and volume deal with three-dimensional shapes. So basically, it's the same idea, but different equations and stuff. So for example, if you had a square in front of you, you could calculate the perimeter and the area of the square. But if I gave you a cube, then you would be calculating the surface area and the volume. So basically the perimeter and the surface area are the 2D and 3D versions of figuring out what's on the outside of the shape. So for example, if it's a square, the perimeter is just figuring out the sum of the lengths of the sides of the square, and the surface area is telling you how much space there is on the surface of the cube. And then area and volume are the 2D and 3D versions of telling you more about what's inside the shape. So the area of a square tells you how much space there is within the boundaries of the square, inside the square, and the volume of a cube tells you how much space there is inside of the cube. So it's the same idea. One's a 2D thing, one's a 3D thing. We'll deal with some simple shapes. I've written simple shapes because we're going to start with just talking about, here's how you calculate perimeter and area of a square, of a rectangle, of a circle, of a triangle. But then at the bottom here, you can see I've written perimeter and area of compound shapes. And what I mean by that is I could ask you to find the perimeter and the area of something that's like a square that's then attached to a triangle, and then there's also a circle attached to it. And if I give you enough numbers of measurements and stuff, that you can calculate the total perimeter and the total area inside that shape. That's sort of the last step we're going to get to. Surface area and volume, we probably won't have time for getting to surface area and volume of compound shapes, which is why I haven't written that in here. And given how many formulas there are that you can see down here, it's already going to be messy enough trying to trying to work with those formulas just to calculate the surface area or volume uh, of a normal simple shape like a cylinder or a sphere or a rectangular prism or something, that we don't need to go in and make it more complicated with sticking different shapes together and then trying to figure out stuff about that. So once we finish the geometry unit, we will move on to exponents and logarithms. In geometry, we won't, we will be dealing with exponents a little bit, but we won't be using them to a huge extent. We will see a little bit of how exponents work in the geometry unit when it comes to squaring a number or cubing a number. But when we get to the exponents and logarithms unit, that's when we'll explore more rules of how to use exponents and little tips and tricks for how to simplify your life when you're doing a problem that has a whole bunch of different exponents in it. So from last year and from the geometry unit, by this point you'll hopefully be familiar with what exponents are and how they work, but we'll still go over it in this unit. We'll talk about the different rules that you can see written here. There's a product rule, a quotient rule, and a power rule for exponents. So basically, if you've got two numbers being multiplied together and they've both got exponents in them, there's a certain trick that works sometimes that you can use in that case. But if they're not being multiplied, but instead they're being divided, then there's a different rule, and so on. So we'll talk about those kinds of tricks. We'll talk about working with exponents that are negative numbers or exponents that are equal to 0, and what those mean and how it can simplify your life. And then we'll finish off this unit by looking at logarithms, which is basically figuring out the missing exponent. So down here, you can see in this example we've been given a power with a base and an exponent, and it's been written out in terms of multiplication, which is basically the essence of exponents. But when it comes to logarithms, logarithms work differently. In the example on the right, you can see that we have the normal integer base number here, and we have the exponent here, but we don't have an answer. We don't know exactly what it's equal to until we go ahead and calculate 8 times 8 times 8. We don't know the answer. So the question that is being asked here would be, what is 8 cubed equal to, or 8 to the raised to the third equal to? With logarithms, it's a little bit different. With logarithms, the answer to that exponents problem, answer in like quotation marks, is given to you, but the exponent isn't given to you. So basically, the way logarithms work is I've given you the base number and I've given you the answer, and I'm asking you what exponent do I need to put in to make this relationship true. So that's the way logarithms are going to help us answer these kinds of questions, and that's something we'll get to in this unit. So the next unit after that will be probability and statistics. This is something that we haven't covered before together. I've learned a little bit about it in school, and I'm hoping to study up on it a little bit in the next couple of weeks to make sure I can give you guys some useful lessons on this. I'm not going to try and make this overly complicated because the equations aren't particularly complicated, but it can be a lot to try and remember all at once if it's not something that you've been doing for a couple of years already, or for if you haven't taken a class on this before. So we're going to keep it to really simple stuff. Probability and statistics will be dealing with things like the outcome of rolling dice. What are the chances of rolling a 9 if you roll 2 dice? What are the chances of rolling a 5 if you roll 1 die? What are the chances of flipping a coin and landing on heads some number of times? So those are the kinds of things that we'll deal with. We'll talk about calculating mean, median, and mode, which are 3 different ways to sort of summarize a collection of data and give sort of an average value, but they work in different ways, and we'll examine how they work differently and which ones are good in which situations. And if we have time, we'll get to a little bit of a discussion about how statistics can be used to sort of skew the results from your data. So the data will be the same, but the way you choose to represent it using statistics can open the door to mislead people and to mislead the masses, if it's something that's being publicized in the news or something. So if we have time, we'll get to a lesson about how we need to be careful when we're working with statistics to try and make sure that we're presenting our information accurately. After that, we'll get into our first sort of big unit. I say big unit because when I was scheduling out these classes, the first 4 units don't take that much time individually, but then after that, this unit and all the units after it take a little bit longer to actually get through all of the material. So you'll most likely see more lessons in these units, so units 5, 6, 7, and 8, than you did in units 1, 2, 3, and 4. So hopefully we'll be done about my original plan was that we would finish the algebra unit, which is this unit 5, by the time the winter break comes around. I'm not really sure right now how that's going to work out with your guys' scheduling and with my scheduling with school, but the goal is to be done unit 5 by the holidays so that there's enough time to do unit 6, 7, and 8 at a relaxed pace after the holidays. But basically, algebra will be going over some of the same things that we did last year. We did a whole bunch of mathematical problems with 1 variable and with 2 variables, working with a system of equations, 2 equations, 2 variables, figuring out what those variables are equal to. What we couldn't do last year was we couldn't do a lot of word problems, and same thing the year before, because during class it just takes so much time, especially on the whiteboard that I was using last year. It takes so much time to write out the problem on the board that it was not going to be beneficial to you guys, because we're going to end up losing half the class to just me writing down the question, and on that small whiteboard there was no room. If I've written down an entire word problem, there's no room to actually do any of the math on it. So I had to sort of throw word problems out the window. But now that we've got this new setup with these PowerPoint lessons, I can make the word problems ahead of time, and then you guys can feel free to pause and copy down the word problem, or to just write down the answer to the word problem as we work through it. So basically the big change in the algebra unit will be word problems. Other than that, we covered a lot of the things that I wanted to cover last year. We'll review some of those things, and then we will up the ante with some word problems. So our next unit after that, unit 6, is linear functions, or basically graphing lines. So we're going to go over some of the same concepts that we covered last year in this unit again. We did spend a good amount of time on linear functions last year, so a lot of this stuff will be very similar to what you saw last year. We'll be working with the Cartesian plane, so we'll review what that is. We'll talk about what linear functions are, what the equation is for a linear function. We'll look at what the different parts of the equation do. We'll try graphing lines using the equation, and then we'll try going the other way, that I give you the graph and you have to tell me the equation based on what you know at that point. We'll work on points of intersection, which you can see on this graph here. Basically what that means is the coordinates of this point where the two lines cross, or where the two lines meet. There's a mathematical way to go about calculating the point of intersection without needing to actually graph it. So we'll get to that later on in the year. And then again, something that we didn't really get to do last year is word problems. So hopefully we'll be able to go through some word problems this year, not necessarily involving just points of intersection, but involving linear functions as a whole. We did get to do a little bit of it last year in algebra and in the linear functions unit, if I'm remembering correctly, but I'm hoping that this year we can dive deeper into working through some word problems, taking out meaningful information from the question, and then applying what we know to get a useful answer. So our 7th unit is going to be quadratic functions. So that's basically parabolas. So basically, if you had your Cartesian plane that looks something like this, those aren't quite straight, but I'm doing the best I can. Then a quadratic function, when it's graphed, looks a little bit like this. That's not a perfect graph, but it's a curve that has one super low point or one super high point. You could graph one differently, one that maybe looks something like this, let's say. Something that looks like that. And they can be super wide or super narrow. You might find parabolas that look much wider, so something like this. And they don't always have to cross the axis or anything. So we'll get into all of that in Unit 7. This thing up here is the quadratic formula, which we will discuss in this unit as well. But yeah, basically we'll talk about quadratic functions, what they are, how to write down the equation of a quadratic function, how to graph them using either form of the equation. So we're going to be focusing on standard form and vertex form of a quadratic function. We'll practice graphing with both ways, and we'll practice getting the equation once we look at the graph. So same thing like with lines. We'll examine the equation, how it works, how to turn the equation into a graph, and then we'll turn the graph into an equation. So same idea, but a little bit more complicated because these aren't straight lines anymore. Aside from that, though, that's basically the plan for this unit. It's pretty much the same setup as linear functions, except we're also throwing in this quadratic formula, which of course we don't have for linear functions. And then same deal as with linear functions, we'll see if we can put together a few word problems. And then finally, our last unit is going to be trigonometry. So here we'll talk about our primary trigonometric ratios. So that's sine, cosine, and tangent. We'll talk about our secondary trigonometric ratios, which are cosecant, secant, and cotangent. And you can see some of those in this diagram up in the corner. Of course, I deliberately picked an image that looks a lot scarier than the stuff that we're going to do. So don't worry about trying to understand whatever's going on with that circle and all those lines. We're not going to be worrying too much about most of the things in that picture, but we're going to be working with the 6 big trigonometric ratios, mostly the first 3, sine, cosine, and tangent. I'll teach you guys about sine law and cosine law. Even though that picture in the top right is showing a circle and then a whole bunch of lines, most of our work is going to be done with triangles. So so expect to see a lot of triangles in this unit. And then again, because we're doing this on PowerPoint, I'm going to try and make full use of it, and we'll put together some word problems as well, where you need to use a little bit of trigonometry to solve it. But yeah, that's about it for this unit. And last but not least, we might have some time for fun math, which has nothing to do with any of the 8 topics or the sort of the 7 major topics and the introductory one that I already plan on covering. So in the event that we have time for something more, something extra, let me know either in a comment, an email, let me know on Instagram, whatever, what it is you want to see this year. If it's anything outside of the things that we've already covered, or even inside those units, if there's something I haven't mentioned yet, or something that you were hoping to see and you haven't seen, let me know and we can talk about it. We can work out when to fit in those kinds of things. Right now, the reason I'm not sure about the scheduling is that when I was planning this out, I was setting up my schedule for the year with math videos to be about 3 or 4 videos every week, and I might try to still record a few videos a week for math, or maybe just a few videos a week altogether for all the subjects. But after talking to your teachers, it seems like we're going to start with just one lesson a week for each class. So one math, one geography, one science lesson per week, um, which might reduce the amount of time that we have to get through the 8 units that I've already listed. And that's not a problem. I can shuffle around things to do, or we can drop the last unit, the trigonometry unit, if we don't have enough time. But if we happen to have extra time anywhere for some reason, or we're getting ahead of schedule, maybe a lesson is shorter than I thought, or you guys are understanding a concept faster than I anticipated, then we might have room for a couple of these fun math lessons in the middle. So yeah, let me know what you guys would like to see. If you have any questions, leave a comment or let me know on social media. Otherwise, I will see you guys in the next lesson. Have a good one.